I am receiving a lot of strange responses to the video I made about an hour ago about 5th edition earnings. And I'm assuming these responses are coming from the confusion between 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons and 5th edition. And in order to understand the difference between 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons and 5th edition, you need to understand the OGL/OSR and everything that has happened in the gaming industry since 2002, since 3.5, Pathfinder, and all that other stuff. So it would take way too long to try and explain everything that happened between 3 and now. And if you're not familiar with what the OGL is and everything that came out of the OGL, I suppose I could do a video on that, but I have a feeling that video would last a couple hours. So let's just clarify a few things. Wizards of the Coast, 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and 5th edition SRD are two separate things. Both are owned by Hasbro. But you can put out product using the 5e engine that has nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons. You could also put out fantasy D20 product using the 5th edition engine. And again, that doesn't have anything to do with Dungeons and Dragons. You could put out Dungeons and Dragons adjacent product, like the stuff we see on DM's Guild, but then there are certain things you have to do, certain hoops you have to jump through in order to get that Wizards of the Coast stamp of approval. But if you want to put stuff out using the 5e engine, but you don't want to deal with Wizards of the Coast, you can still do that. Okay, so and this goes back to what we were talking about in the previous video, what 5e is, what Wizards of the Coast 5e is, and where Wizards of the Coast thinks they want it to go, what 5e is, and where the third parties are in relation to 5e. 5e is a game engine, a D20 game engine based upon the Dungeons and Dragons rule set that we are all familiar with. Strength, Dex, Con, Intelligence, Wisdom, Charisma, hit points, armor class, level, classes, or archetype. If you had to break down those mechanics, that would be what defines anything that falls under 5e. If you use any permutation of those in a product, you have to at least give a nod to 5e as per the open game license, as per the SRD, as per collective core, or whatever it's called. Now I'm probably getting a lot of stuff wrong, but again, I could put something out right now and use the 5e engine, D20, Strength, Dex, Con, Intelligence, Wisdom, Charisma, armor class, hit points, level, classes, and I'd be fine. And by using it and by saying it's 5e, I do get to milk a little of that 5e money and a little of that 5e recognition. The OGL is, OGL compatible, D&D compatible, D&D 3.5 compatible. It's... And then, of course, the OGL products evolved past being D&D compatible, but if they're still using that stat block, they're still using what was laid down by Wizards as the OGL, which at some point, in some directions, Wizards of the Coast / Hasbro receives something from that. Could be money, could just be notoriety. But I could put something out right now, and I could get that 5e stamp if I use those things and I follow all the rules set down by the SRD / OGL. Okay, so there's 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons created by Wizards of the Coast. And the direction Wizards of the Coast is taking 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons is based upon what they think the audience wants. And as long as Wizards of the Coast Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition holds that top spot in sales, holds that 53, 55%, is making that 20% income. The direction Wizards of the Coast is taking 5e is not going to change. All right, we're not talking about Wizards of the Coast 5e. We're talking about 5e. Now, 5e, you have a couple different camps. You have the Dungeons and Dragons adjacent camp. That's the Goodman Games stuff. That's some of the Necromancer Games stuff. That's, anything you see on DM's Guild. That's any product that says approved for use with Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition or approved for use with Wizards of the Coast Dungeons and Dragons. If it has that little 5 in a circle and it has that little D&D circle in it, it is what we would call 5e adjacent, which means there might be a lot of different things, but it is still close enough to what we recognize as Dungeons and Dragons that it is Dungeons and Dragons adjacent. And if you want examples, all the stuff Goodman Games is doing, all the stuff Kobold Press is doing, everything on DM's Guild would fall under the 5e adjacent. Then there's 5e fantasy, which is a larger bubble of which the 5e adjacent bubble falls into. Third-party 5e fantasy that has nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons. It doesn't have that Wizards of the Coast stamp on it, but it still has the 5e on it. And a perfect example of that would be Iron Kingdoms, or, some eclectic, bizarre fantasy like the Roman one, Aegis 2011 or whatever it's called, or, the game of Afrocentric fantasy that uses the 5e engine. So those are not D&D products, but they're fantasy products. And they're counting on the fact that they're saying 5e to make your subconscious brain go, oh, Dungeons and Dragons, and might increase the chances of buying it. But they're not D&D, and which means they can go a lot farther in changes. We talked about a very grim, dark product coming out, and a lot of the 5e adjacent fantasy products are going for sort of more of that grim, dark Warhammer feel. They're not Dungeons and Dragons products, but they're 5e D20 fantasy products. So they're another step away. They can still call themselves 5e because they're still using the common core of 5e. Strength, dex, con, intelligence, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean. Then we have people who are doing stuff with 5e that has nothing to do at all with fantasy. And Essence D20 sort of falls in there, but not really. It straddles the line. It could definitely call itself OGL. Mutants and Masterminds straddles the line. It can still call itself OGL. It could say it's using the 5e engine, but it's definitely not Dungeons and Dragons. Any product that is not fantasy or not D&D adjacent would fall under the other bubble. So bubble one, we have fantasy 5e, of which Dungeons and Dragons adjacent is one half. The other half is all the other stuff, like the Grimsdark stuff or the Iron Kingdom stuff. It's still fantasy, but it's far enough removed that either you can't call it D&D, or because you're going for a different audience, you don't want to call it D&D. Then you have the everything else market. And that's all the people who are using the 5e, D20, Strength, Dex, Con mechanics to make other systems, other game worlds that still use what we're familiar with. So that would be like, I don't know, like the Amazing Adventures. There's a perfect one. Pulp action. 1940s, 1950s pulp action, modern day Earth. Guns and spies and stuff like that. Post World War II. Nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons, but it can still use the 5e engine. It can still use those mechanics and say it's approved for use with 5e. I don't know. I don't want to say a product and be wrong, so I'm just going to make a product up. Look, there's a lunch truck over there. So, Lunch Truck, the role-playing game, or that biker role-playing game I talked about earlier today. Those could use the 5e engine that we are familiar with, not be made by Wizards of the Coast, not have the approved by Wizards of the Coast, not have the approved for use with Dungeons and Dragons standard. There's no way that, you know, Lunch Truck, the role-playing game, or Motorcycle Gang, the role-playing game, is ever going to be considered a D&D product. But it can still use the 5e engine. Okay, so that's the difference, and I think that's where the confusion comes from. Wizards of the Coast, Hasbro, owns Dungeons and Dragons. But Wizards of the Coast, Hasbro, has allowed other people, they have no choice, long story, not going to get into it, to use the 5th edition engine that we're familiar with, that allows for third-party fantasy stuff, that allows for third-party D&D adjacent stuff, and allows for third-party companies to do 5th edition space, 5th edition Old West, 5th edition Cyberpunk, 5th edition Lunch Truck, 5th edition, I don't know, anything you can think of, any genre, any game, any style, any name, but it's using the 5e engine, it's using the 5e that we're familiar with, but it has nothing to do with Hasbro or Wizards of the Coast, other than that, you know, whatever Wizards of the Coast still gets out of people using the OGL. But again, you right now could put a product out and say it's 5e adjacent, as long as it uses the agreed upon information and follows the standards and practices as put down in the current OGL/SRD. And you don't have to have anything to do with Wizards of the Coast. It doesn't have to say D&D approved. It doesn't have to say Wizards of the Coast approved. It could be any setting you want. You're just taking advantage of the engine because you feel the engine works, or you're, you know, taking a shortcut and hoping that if I use 5e, it'll trigger something subconsciously and people will buy it because they think 5e equals Dungeons and Dragons. And that's what they're counting on. That's part of what they're counting on. They're counting on you to think the same mistake a lot of other people make, that 5e is only owned by Wizards of the Coast. And anything that comes out that says 5e is approved for use with 5e Dungeons & Dragons. But again, Wizards of the Coast D20 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons and 5th edition the engine are two separate beasts. And you can make stuff for one and have nothing to do with the other, and vice versa. You could make 5e product, approved for use with 5e Dungeons and Dragons, and put it up on DM's Guild, as long as you follow everything Wizards of the Coast says you have to follow in order to get that approved for use with 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. But if you don't want to, you can still make shit. Okay? So hopefully I have badly explained the phenomenon that is 5e, and why we are seeing 5e products going in unusual directions that have nothing to do with Wizards of the Coast 5th edition. You have to understand, again, there's a difference. Wizards of the Coast 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, Dungeons & Dragons adjacent, and just stuff that people are making using 5e. Hopefully I have clarified that, or made your confusion even worse. That's all I feel like talking about today. We'll be back tomorrow, where we'll probably talk about the Gen Con nonsense, but that's it for today. I'm done. I'll talk to you later.